They say courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite it. I never understood that saying until I found myself in a trench beside creatures I'd once considered primitive, watching something emerge from the void that made our worst nightmares seem like children's bedtime stories. My name is HFY, and I was, a proud member of the Zilani Imperial Guard, elite warriors of a species that had conquered 17 star systems before humans had even discovered fire. We were stronger, faster, more technologically advanced. We lived longer, thought deeper, and our military tactics were studied across the galaxy as examples of perfect warfare. Then the Devourers came. In 72 hours, they tore through our mighty fleets like paper, turned our fortress worlds into graveyards, and sent the survivors of a 1,000-year empire fleeing into the dark corners of space. That's when we met the humans, those strange, short-lived bipeds from a backwater world called Earth. What I witnessed fighting beside them changed everything I thought I knew about strength, about courage, and about what it truly means to face the impossible. This is the story of how I learned that sometimes the smallest flame burns brightest in the deepest darkness, and how a species we'd dismissed as barely civilized taught an entire galaxy what it means to never surrender. The terror I faced wasn't just the enemy before us, it was the realization that everything I'd believed about power and superiority was wrong. The emergency klaxons had been screaming for 3 days straight when I finally made it to the evacuation bays of Zilani Prime. My ceremonial armor, once polished to mirror brightness, was scorched and dented from running battles through the capital's burning streets. Around me, thousands of my people pressed toward the remaining transport ships, their usual composed dignity shattered by something I'd never seen before in Zilani's eyes. Pure, animal terror. I was HFY of the 73rd Stellar Legion, bearer of the Crimson Star, veteran of the Proxima campaign where we'd crushed the rebellious Thorian collective in less than a standard month. My kill count stood at 412 confirmed enemies across 6 different worlds. I had served the Empire for 67 years, and in all that time, I had never run from anything. But we were running now. The Devourers had appeared without warning at the edge of our system 3 days ago. Our deep space monitoring stations had detected them first. Massive, organic-looking vessels that seemed to absorb light itself, moving in formations that hurt to look at directly. Fleet Commander Thyssian had deployed our 7th Battle Group to intercept them, confident that our superior technology would make short work of whatever primitive species had stumbled into Imperial space. The 7th Battle Group consisted of 240 vessels, including the mighty dreadnought Imperial Wrath, whose particle cannons could crack a moon in half. They'd engaged the Devourer fleet at the asteroid belt, and we'd all gathered around the communication screens to watch our inevitable victory. Instead, we watched our ships die. The Devourers didn't use energy weapons or projectiles. They didn't need to. Their vessels somehow reached out with tendrils of living shadow that passed through our shields as if they didn't exist, then began converting our ships' hulls into something else. Something that writhed and pulsed with malevolent life. Within minutes, our proud warships became twisted amalgamations of metal and flesh that turned their weapons on their former allies. The Imperial Wrath lasted longest, its crew fighting desperately as the conversion crept through their corridors. The last transmission we received was from Captain Veltar himself, screaming orders to abandon ship even as the bridge walls began to bleed. After that, the Devourers continued their advance towards Zilani Prime, now accompanied by the corrupted remnants of our fleet. I'd been in the Planetary Defense Command Center when they reached our orbital stations. The same horror repeated itself, our defenses turning against us. Our people transformed into something that was no longer recognizably alive. The planetary shields held for perhaps an hour before they, too, began to change, their energy barriers becoming hungry mouths that pulled our own fighters inside. The surface bombardment that followed wasn't meant to destroy us, it was meant to harvest us. Now, pushing through the chaos of the evacuation bay, I tried to process what I'd seen during my escape from the command center. Devourer drop pods had been landing across the capital, disgorging creatures that moved like liquid shadow given form. But worse were the converted Zilani, my own people, changed into hollow-eyed servants that spoke in harmonious whispers about the joy of joining the collective. HFY! I turned at the sound of my name to see Sub-Commander Yithal struggling toward me through the crowd. Half her face was covered in medical gel where something had burned her, but she still moved with military precision. Sub-Commander, I acknowledged, falling into step beside her. What's the status of the remaining fleets? Her expression told me everything before she spoke. Third Fleet at Balerian Sector went dark 6 hours ago. Fifth Fleet attempted to regroup at the Tyler's shipyards, but she gestured helplessly. The shipyards themselves have been compromised. The Devourers aren't just taking our ships. They're taking our infrastructure, our planets, everything. We reached the loading ramp of a military transport, where a crowd of civilians pressed desperately forward. Most were families with younglings, their usual proud bearing replaced by desperate urgency. A handful of Imperial guards tried to maintain order, but even they looked shaken. "Where are we evacuating to?" I asked as we joined the queue. "Refugee convoy designation Gamma 7, Ythal replied, "along with whatever civilian ships we could gather. The destination is—" She paused, checking her datapad with obvious distaste. "Human space." I stopped walking. Human space? Those primitives barely have interstellar capability. What protection could they possibly offer? "They're the only major power that hasn't been hit yet," she said quietly, "and they've sent word that they're willing to accept refugees." She looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. "Kethvar, in the past 72 hours, the Devourers have consumed or converted 17 Imperial worlds, 4 allied systems, and the entire Morgothi Republic. Half the galaxy is gone. The humans may be primitive, but they're offering sanctuary, and right now, that's more than anyone else is doing." The transport's engines were already spinning up as we boarded. Through the viewports, I could see the familiar skyline of Thaisaline, the capital city where I'd been born and trained. Smoke rose from a dozen districts, and strange pulsing growths were visible on the sides of the government towers. Even as I watched, one of the great bronze statues of our war heroes began to shift and change, its metal form becoming something organic and wrong. The transport lifted off with a shudder, joining a ragged convoy of ships fleeing the world that had been the heart of the Empire for over a millennium. As we climbed through the atmosphere, I got my first clear view of the Devourer fleet. They filled the sky like a plague of insects, their organic hulls glistening wetly in the light of our sun. But it wasn't their numbers that made my blood run cold. It was their organization. They moved in perfect coordination, as if controlled by a single vast intelligence. And at the center of their formation sat something that defied description, a vessel so large it cast a shadow across half the continent below. "Sweet ancestors," breathed another passenger, a young civilian who pressed his face against the viewport. "What are they doing to our world?" The answer became clear as we gained altitude. The Devourers weren't occupying Zalani Prime, they were consuming it. Vast root-like structures had already begun growing from the impact sites of their landing pods, spreading across the surface like a cancer. Where they touched, the very earth seemed to come alive, pulsing and writhing with unnatural life. Our world was being digested. The convoy jumped to hyperspace 3 hours later, leaving behind the smoking ruins of an empire that had endured for over 2,000 years. In the cargo bay of our transport, 67 Zalani civilians and military personnel sat in stunned silence, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what we'd lost. I found myself thinking about the humans as we fled through the void. I'd encountered them briefly during the tireless negotiations 5 years ago. Short, soft-looking creatures with brief lifespans and primitive technology. Their ambassador had been polite but unremarkable, and I dismissed them as another minor species that would eventually be absorbed into the Empire when we got around to expanding in their direction. Now they were our only hope. The journey to human space took 18 standard days. During that time, reports continued to filter in through the long-range communications array. The Devourers had consumed 3 more major civilizations and were spreading outward in all directions like a stain across the galaxy. No one could stop them. No one could even slow them down. The military transports in our convoy tried to maintain some semblance of order and discipline, but the civilian ships were descending into chaos. Food riots broke out on the passenger liner Star of Thissa. 2 freighters had to be abandoned when their life support systems failed. A luxury yacht carrying members of the Imperial Council suffered a complete breakdown in its navigation system and was never seen again. We were the remnants of a galactic superpower, reduced to begging for shelter from a species we'd considered beneath our notice. When we finally dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system, I got my first good look at human defenses. They were unimpressive. A handful of space stations that looked like they'd been cobbled together from industrial modules, and perhaps 24 ships that barely qualified as military vessels by Imperial standards. But there was something else. Something that made me lean closer to the viewport. The humans had built their defensive positions in depth, with multiple layers of detection grids and weapon platforms. Their ship formations weren't the elegant geometric patterns favored by advanced civilizations, but they were positioned with a brutal practicality that suggested real combat experience. More importantly, They weren't running. Refugee Convoy Gamma 7. This is Seoul Defense Command. Came a transmission in accented but clear Galactic Standard. We have been expecting you. Please maintain current heading and prepare for escort to Processing Station Harmony. 3 human ships moved to flank our convoy. Sleek destroyers that looked fast and deadly despite their smaller size. As they took position, I noticed something odd about their hulls. They were scarred and patched, showing signs of recent combat. Sub-Commander, I said to Yithol, who was monitoring the communications array. Ask them about those battle damages. She sent the query and received a response within minutes. When she turned back to me, her expression was thoughtful. They say they've been fighting running battles with Devourer scouts for the past week, she reported. Apparently the humans have been actively engaging them along their borders. I stared at her. Engaging them? But that's suicide. The Devourers convert everything they touch. That's what I said, Yithal replied. But according to their tactical officer, they've developed countermeasures. They claim to have destroyed 17 Devourer vessels without losing a single ship to conversion. The idea seemed impossible. The Devourers had swept through the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy like they were nothing. How could these primitive humans have found a way to fight them when we couldn't? The processing station turned out to be a massive converted asteroid base, clearly built in haste but functionally sound. As our transport docked, I saw other refugee ships from across the galaxy, Morgothi cruisers with their distinctive crystal hulls, Taurian colony vessels, even a few Catherian battleships that had somehow escaped the destruction of their homeworld. Hundreds of thousands of refugees from dozens of species, all seeking shelter in human space. The human officials who processed us were efficient and surprisingly compassionate. They provided food, medical care, and temporary housing without asking for anything in return. But what struck me most was their demeanor. They weren't treating us like defeated enemies or burdens to be tolerated. They were treating us like allies. Welcome to Soul Space, said the human administrator who handled our military group, a middle-aged woman with prematurely grey hair and tired eyes. I'm Colonel Martinez, liaison officer for military refugees. I know you've lost everything, and I'm sorry for that. But you're safe here, and if you're willing, we could use your help. Our help? I asked, surprised. We're refugees. Our fleets are destroyed, our worlds are gone. What could we possibly offer you? She smiled grimly. Experience, knowledge, most importantly, the will to fight back. The Devourers may have taken your worlds, but they haven't taken your spirit. We're putting together a combined fleet, human ships with alien crews, alien technology integrated with human tactics. The goal isn't just survival anymore. It's victory. I looked around at my fellow Zilani officers. Most still wore the hollow-eyed look of beings who had seen their entire civilization crushed in a matter of days. But I saw something else in their eyes now. A spark of something that hadn't been there during our desperate flight. Hope. What did you have in mind? I asked. Colonel Martinez activated a holographic display that showed the current tactical situation. Red zones marked Devourer-controlled space, which now covered nearly a third of the known galaxy. Blue zones showed the remaining free systems, a scattered archipelago of worlds barely holding on. And at the center of the largest blue zone was a single yellow star. We're going to make our stand here, she said simply. Earth is the rallying point. Every free species, every surviving fleet, every refugee with the will to fight. We're going to show these Devourers what happens when they threaten our homes. She turned to face us directly, and I saw something in her eyes that I recognized. The same look I'd seen in the mirror before every major campaign of my military career. The look of a warrior preparing for battle. The question is, are you with us? For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than despair. These humans, these supposed primitives, were offering us something our own empire never could have. A second chance. I straightened into a proper military posture and gave her the traditional Zilani salute of acceptance. Colonel Martinez, I said formally, the remnants of the 73rd Stellar Legion hereby volunteer for service in the defense of the free galaxy. Around me, every other Zilani officer in the room did the same. It was the beginning of an alliance that would reshape everything I thought I knew about warfare, about courage, and about what it truly meant to never surrender. But I couldn't know that then. All I knew was that for the first time since the Devourers had appeared, I felt like a soldier again instead of a refugee. And somewhere in the depths of space, the enemy that had consumed half the galaxy continued its relentless advance toward Earth, unaware that they were about to face something they had never encountered before. Beings who would rather die fighting than live in surrender. The human training facility on Luna was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Where the Imperial Academy had focused on rigid formations and textbook tactics, the humans trained for chaos. They called it adaptive combat methodology, but watching them in action, it looked more like controlled madness. I'd been assigned to integrate with the crew of a human destroyer called the Defiant Hope, along with 12 other Zilani officers and representatives from 6 other refugee species. The ship's captain was a young human named Sarah Chen, barely 30 years old by their measure, practically a child by Zilani standards. Yet she carried herself with the confidence of a veteran commander, and her crew followed her orders without question. The key to fighting Devourers, Captain Chen explained during our first briefing, isn't superior firepower or better shields, it's unpredictability. They're a hive mind. They learn from every engagement, adapt to every tactic, and share that knowledge instantly across their entire force. But that's also their weakness. She activated the tactical display showing recordings of recent engagements. I watched as human ships performed maneuvers that violated every principle of space warfare I'd ever learned, breaking formation at critical moments, deliberately exposing vulnerable flanks, even ramming attacks that should have been suicidal. Conventional tactics become predictable after the first few uses, Chen continued. So we don't use conventional tactics. Every engagement is different. Every ship captain has the authority to improvise on the spot. We fight like individuals, not like parts of a machine. Sub-Commander Yithel, who had also been assigned to the Defiant Hope, raised a skeptical hand. Captain, I've reviewed your combat reports. Your casualty rates are significantly higher than standard Imperial doctrine would predict. How do you justify such losses? Chen's expression grew serious. Because the alternative is extinction. Yes, we lose ships. Yes, we lose people, but we're still fighting. And every day we fight is another day to find better solutions. The Zilani Empire tried to fight the Devourers with perfect formations and flawless tactics. How did that work out? The brutal honesty of her response silenced the room. She was right, of course. Our perfection had been our downfall. The Devourers had studied us, learned from us, and turned our own precision against us. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into learning human military doctrine. It was frustrating at first. They seemed to have no respect for proper chain of command, allowing junior officers to question senior decisions openly. Their tactical manuals read more like philosophical treatises than military guidelines, full of phrases like embrace the chaos and turn disadvantage into opportunity. But slowly, I began to understand what they were really doing. The humans hadn't developed superior technology or discovered some secret weakness in the Devourers. Instead, they had weaponized their own fundamental nature, their unpredictability, their tendency toward individual initiative, their absolute refusal to accept defeat, even when logic demanded surrender. We're not trying to outthink the Devourers, explained Commander Williams during a strategy session. We're trying to be so incomprehensibly chaotic that they can't predict us at all. It's like trying to apply mathematical formulas to pure randomness. The first time I saw this philosophy in action was during a patrol mission near the Outer Rim. Our sensor operator, a nervous-looking human named Patterson, detected a Devourer scout ship approaching a civilian convoy. Standard Imperial procedure would have been to form battle line, engage at maximum range, and attempt to protect the convoy through superior firepower. Captain Chen ordered something completely different. All ships, scatter formation, she commanded. Random vectors, random speeds. Make us look like we're running in panic. I watched in horrified fascination as our squadron of 8 ships broke apart like frightened fish, each vessel heading in a different direction at seemingly random velocities. The Devourer's scout, probably confused by our behavior, chose to pursue the largest target, our flagship, which was exactly what Chen had been counting on. As the enemy ship closed on us, she waited until the last possible moment before ordering a full reversal. The Defiant Hope spun on its axis and accelerated directly toward the Devourer vessel, weapons blazing. But instead of trying to engage in a standard battle, we began performing evasive maneuvers that made no tactical sense, spiraling, weaving, even flying backwards while firing. The Devourer ship, designed to counter logical military responses, couldn't adapt to our seemingly random behavior quickly enough. Our other ships, which hadn't actually been fleeing, converged from unexpected angles and destroyed the enemy vessel before it could begin its conversion process. That was... Yithel struggled for words as we watched the Devourer ship break apart. That was completely insane. That was effective, Chen corrected. Insanity is just sanity that hasn't been properly explained yet. The victory felt different from anything I'd experienced in my Imperial service. We hadn't won through superior strength or perfect execution. We'd won through creativity and adaptation. It was intoxicating and terrifying at the same time. But the real test came 2 months later, when the Devourers launched their first major assault on human space. They came in a wave unlike anything we'd seen before. Not the organized fleets that had crushed our worlds, but a sprawling mass of converted ships and organic vessels that stretched across dozens of star systems. Intelligence reports suggested they'd learned from their encounters with human forces and were adapting their approach. The battle began at the Proxima Centauri checkpoint, where a hastily assembled fleet of human vessels and alien refugees prepared to make their stand. I was aboard the Defiant Hope, now serving as weapons coordinator, after proving my ability to adapt to human tactical thinking. When the Devourers arrived, they didn't attack immediately. Instead, they hung at the edge of the system, their vessels pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that hurt to look at directly. "They're analyzing us," reported Lieutenant Commander Torres from the sensor station. "Cataloging our ship types, weapon signatures, formation patterns. They're trying to predict our behavior before they engage." Captain Chen smiled grimly. "Then let's give them something to think about." She opened a channel to the entire fleet. "All vessels, this is Defiant Hope. Operation Madhouse is now in effect. You know what to do." What happened next defied every principle of military organization I'd ever learned. The human fleet didn't just break formation, it descended into apparent chaos. Ships began moving in random patterns, some accelerating toward the enemy, others retreating, some spinning in place. Weapon signatures changed constantly as different vessels powered up different systems in seemingly random sequences. To any outside observer, it would have looked like a complete breakdown in command and control. But I was beginning to understand human thinking well enough to see the method in the madness. Hidden within the chaos were actual tactical movements, strike groups positioning themselves for attack runs, support vessels moving to optimal firing positions, scout ships probing for weaknesses. The randomness wasn't random at all. It was camouflage. The Devourers, faced with behavior that their analytical processes couldn't pass, finally decided to attack. Their fleet swept forward in perfect formation, expecting to encounter standard defensive positions. Instead, they flew into a trap. The human ships that had seemed to be fleeing suddenly reversed course and struck at the enemy flanks. The vessels that had appeared to be retreating opened fire from concealed positions. And at the center of it all, a group of captured Devourer ships, vessels we'd taken and modified with human technology, turned their weapons on their former allies. The battle that followed was unlike anything in the history of space warfare. It wasn't a contest between two organized fleets. It was a brawl in 3 dimensions, with individual ships engaging in personal duels while larger groups formed and dissolved like schools of fish. There were no battle lines, no coordinated movements, just hundreds of vessels fighting with desperate creativity. I found myself in the thick of it, coordinating weapons fire with a crew that included 2 humans, a Thorian engineer, a Cytherian navigator, and a Morgothi tactical specialist. We spoke 4 different languages, operated on completely different timescales, and had wildly different approaches to problem solving. It shouldn't have worked. By all logical standards, we should have been a disaster. Instead, we were magnificent. Devourer heavy cruiser bearing 27 Mark IV, called out Ensign Martinez from sensors. "It's trying to get conversion tendrils on the refugee transport New Thissa." "I see it," I replied, calculating firing solutions with the enhanced reflexes of my species. "But our main guns can't get a clean shot without risking civilian casualties." "Then we don't use main guns," said Chief Petty Officer Harrison with a grin that I was learning to associate with human tactical insanity. "Cytherian, can you get us within boarding range?" Our Cytherian navigator, whose real name was an ultrasonic whistle that humans couldn't pronounce, extended her sensory tendrils toward the navigation console. "Risky. Very risky, but possible." "Morgothi, what's the structural weakness on those conversion tendrils?" Martinez asked. Our tactical specialist's crystalline form shifted as she accessed her species' extensive database on Devourer anatomy. "Neural clusters at base of appendages. Disruption causes temporary paralysis." "Perfect," said Captain Chen from the command chair. "Harrison, prep a boarding party. We're going to cut those tendrils off manually." What followed was the kind of maneuver that would have resulted in court-martial under Imperial regulations. We flew the Defiant Hope directly at the Devourer cruiser, using our point defense systems to clear a path through the conversion tendrils. At the last moment, we fired grappling hooks and pulled alongside the enemy vessel. Human Marines, equipped with modified cutting tools designed by Thorian engineers and guided by Cytherian sensory enhancement, boarded the Devourer ship and began systematically severing its conversion appendages. Meanwhile, Zalani heavy weapons specialists, myself included, provided covering fire from our ship's airlocks. It was completely mad. It was tactically unsound. It was probably impossible. It worked. The Devourer cruiser, crippled and unable to complete its conversion process, became vulnerable to conventional weapons fire. 3 other ships in our squadron destroyed it within minutes, and the refugee transport escaped to safety. But the real revelation came when we analyzed the tactical data afterward. The Devourers, faced with an action so illogical that their analytical processes couldn't categorize it, had frozen for nearly 47 seconds, an eternity in space combat. During that time, other human ships had exploited similar moments of confusion to destroy 6 more enemy vessels. They can't adapt to something they can't understand, Captain Chen explained during the post-battle briefing. And they can't understand us because we don't understand ourselves half the time. We just make it up as we go along. The battle lasted 14 hours. When it was over, the Devourer fleet had been completely destroyed for the first time since their invasion began. Not converted, not driven off, but actually destroyed. The victory sent shockwaves through both the human defense network and the refugee communities. But for me personally, the most profound moment came during the cleanup operations that followed. I was working alongside Chief Harrison to repair damage to our weapons systems when he asked me something that stopped me cold. Kefva, can I ask you something? Back when your empire was still around, would you have ever tried a boarding action like that? I thought about it honestly. No? Too risky. Too many variables. Imperial doctrine would have called for a long-range engagement with maximum firepower. And if that hadn't worked, we would have retreated and requested reinforcements. Harrison nodded thoughtfully. That's the difference, I think. You guys always had backup plans. Reinforcements to call, safe harbors to retreat to. We don't have any of that. Earth is it. If we lose here, there's nowhere else to go. So we can't afford to think about retreat or backup plans. We just have to win. His words hit me like a physical blow. He was right, of course. The Zolani Empire had always fought with the knowledge that defeat was temporary, that losses could be replaced, that there would always be another chance. The humans were fighting with the knowledge that this was their only chance. That realization changed something fundamental in how I viewed courage. I'd always thought of bravery as the absence of fear, or perhaps as the ability to overcome fear through discipline and training. But watching the humans fight, I began to understand that true courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about being absolutely terrified and doing what needed to be done anyway. They weren't fearless. They were terrified every moment of every battle. But they fought anyway, because the alternative was the extinction of everything they loved. And slowly working alongside them, breathing the same recycled air and sharing the same desperate hope, I began to understand what that felt like. The Devourers would be back. Intelligence reports suggested they were massing for an even larger assault, one that would dwarf the force we'd just defeated. But for the first time since the fall of the Empire, I felt ready for them. Not because I was no longer afraid, but because I'd learned something from these remarkable humans. Sometimes being afraid is exactly what makes you dangerous. The nightmare began 6 months after our victory at Proxima Centauri. Intelligence had been tracking increased Devourer activity along the galactic rim for weeks, but nothing had prepared us for what emerged from the dark space between stars. It wasn't a fleet this time. It was an entity so vast that our sensors initially classified it as a rogue planet. Only when it began moving with purpose did we realize we were looking at a single, living construct the size of a small moon. "Dear God," whispered Lieutenant Torres, as the tactical display updated with the object's dimensions. "It's over 2,000 kilometers across." I stood beside Captain Chen on the bridge of the Defiant Hope, watching as our long-range sensors painted an increasingly horrifying picture. The thing wasn't just large, it was actively growing, consuming asteroids and space debris to add to its mass. Worse, it was accompanied by what appeared to be the converted remnants of every fleet the Devourers had ever defeated, including ships I recognized from the old Imperial Navy. "Analysis complete," reported our Morbithi tactical specialist, her crystalline form flickering with distressed patterns. "The entity appears to be a mobile processing station. It's converting raw matter into new Devourer vessels at an exponential rate." Captain Chen's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. "Time to intercept?" "Approximately 72 hours if it maintains current velocity," Torres replied. "But sir, our entire combined fleet wouldn't even scratch something that size." She was right, of course. The human defense network had grown considerably since the first refugee arrivals. Incorporating survivors from dozens of species and their combined technologies, But even at full strength, we could field perhaps 300 vessels against an enemy that could absorb our entire firepower and convert it into additional weapons platforms. For a moment, I felt the old Zolani despair creeping back, the same hopeless certainty I'd experienced watching our homeworld die. This was impossible. No tactics, no matter how creative, could overcome such overwhelming force. Then I looked at Captain Chen's face and saw something that stopped my spiral into defeat. She wasn't looking at the tactical display with despair or resignation. She was looking at it with the same expression she wore when studying particularly challenging combat scenarios during training exercises. "Ma'am," Taurus prompted when the silence stretched too long. "Send a message to Earth Command," Chen said finally. "Priority Alpha. Tell them we need every ship that can fly, every weapon that can fire, and every pilot crazy enough to volunteer for a suicide mission." She turned to address the bridge crew. "Also tell them we're going to need the Prometheus package." I saw several human officers exchange worried glances. The Prometheus package was something I'd heard whispered about in the corridors, but never fully explained. Some kind of experimental program that even the humans seemed to consider extreme. "Captain," I said carefully, "may I ask what the Prometheus package involves?" Her smile was grim. "Something your empire would never have approved of, Kethvar. We're going to turn our greatest weakness into our greatest weapon." The next day brought the largest gathering of refugee and human forces in the war's history. Ships from every surviving species converged on the Sol system's outer defense perimeter, creating a hodgepodge fleet that looked more like a scrapyard than a military force. Sleek Cytherian scouts flew alongside battered human destroyers. Massive Thorian cargo haulers had been converted into improvised carriers. Even ancient Solani ceremonial vessels, never intended for combat, had been fitted with whatever weapons could be found. But it was the human ships that caught my attention. They looked different, modified in ways that made no sense from a military standpoint. External hull plating had been removed from critical areas, exposing internal systems. Weapon hardpoints had been reconfigured with equipment I didn't recognize. Most disturbing of all, many of the vessels showed signs of recent internal renovations that suggested their crews were preparing for something far worse than death. The briefing took place aboard the human command ship Constitution, a massive vessel that served as the coordination center for the refugee fleets. Representatives from every species crowded into the main conference room, creating a babble of voices and translation protocols that would have been impossible to manage under normal circumstances. Admiral Jang, the overall commander of human space forces, waited for the chaos to subside before activating the main tactical display. The image of the approaching devourer entity filled the room, its writhing surface covered in what appeared to be the half-converted remains of entire civilizations. "Ladies, gentlemen, and distinguished beings," the Admiral began, "we're facing an enemy that cannot be defeated through conventional means. Our combined firepower is insufficient, our defenses inadequate, and our chances of victory essentially zero using standard tactical approaches." Murmurs of dismay rippled through the assembled officers, but Jan continued without pause. "Therefore, we're not going to use standard tactical approaches. We're going to do something that has never been attempted in the history of galactic warfare. Something so insane that the Devourer's analytical processes won't be able to comprehend it until it's too late." The display changed to show a schematic of human space, with particular emphasis on Earth's solar system. Red indicators marked the locations of every major industrial facility, population center, and military installation. "The Prometheus package," Jang explained, "is based on a simple premise. If we can't defend our civilization, we'll weaponize it." I felt a chill run down my spine as the implications became clear. "You're talking about turning Earth itself into a weapon," I said, voicing what everyone in the room was thinking. "Not just Earth," Jang replied. "Every world, every space station, every asteroid mining facility in human space. If the Devourers want to consume our civilization, they're going to find it very difficult to digest." The plan that unfolded over the next several hours was simultaneously brilliant and horrifying. The humans had spent months secretly installing what they called conversion charges throughout their territory. Sophisticated devices that could trigger runaway nuclear reactions in everything from planetary cores to space station reactors. If activated simultaneously, they would turn the entire Sol system into a massive bomb. But that wasn't the insane part. The insane part was that they intended to lure the Devourer entity into the system and detonate everything while their own fleets were still inside the blast radius. "This is suicide," protested Commander Velthus of the surviving Morbithi fleet. "You're proposing to destroy your own homeworld, to stop an enemy that will simply regenerate elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Not suicide, corrected Captain Chen, who had been selected to coordinate the fleet-level tactical operations. Sacrifice. There's a difference. She activated a secondary display showing long-range sensor data from the galactic rim. Intelligence indicates the entity we're facing is the Devourer's primary processing hub. It contains the accumulated knowledge and biological templates from every civilization they've consumed. If we can destroy it completely, not just damage it, but vaporize every molecule, we'll cripple their ability to adapt and reproduce. And if you're wrong? I asked. Chen's expression didn't change. Then we die knowing we gave everything we had to give. But at least we'll die fighting. The room fell silent as the magnitude of what was being proposed sank in. The humans weren't just planning to fight a hopeless battle. They were planning to sacrifice their entire civilization for the chance to deal a crippling blow to the Devourers. Over the following hours, as the details were hammered out, I began to understand something profound about human nature that I'd never grasped before. They weren't fearless or naturally brave. They were, in fact, deeply afraid. Afraid of death, afraid of extinction, afraid of failing their loved ones. But they had taken that fear and transformed it into something else entirely. An absolute determination that if their civilization was going to end, it would end on their own terms. The refugee representatives were given a choice. They could evacuate to the edge of the system and attempt to escape when the trap was sprung. Or they could stay and participate in what might be the final battle of the war. I want to be clear, Admiral Zhang told us during the final planning session. No one is asking you to die for Earth. Your species have already sacrificed enough. If you choose to withdraw, no one will think less of you. I looked around the room at my fellow refugees, survivors from a dozen different worlds, representatives of civilizations that had already been consumed by the very enemy we now faced. In their faces, I saw the same transformation that had been occurring within myself over the past months. We were no longer refugees. We had become something else. Sub-Commander Yithel was the first to speak. Admiral, the 73rd Stellar Legion requests permission to remain and participate in the operation. One by one, every other species representative made the same choice. The Thorians would stay. The Catherians would stay. Even the normally peaceful Morgatai would stay. We had all learned something from the humans. Sometimes the only way to truly live is to be willing to die for something greater than yourself. The Devourer entity entered the Sol system 2 days later, its massive bulk casting shadows across the outer planets as it began consuming Jupiter's moons to fuel its continued growth. Our combined fleet took position in Earth's orbit, creating a defensive perimeter that looked pathetically small compared to the approaching nightmare. But appearances can be deceiving. Hidden throughout the system were over 3,000 modified ships and stations, each one equipped with experimental weapons that had been developed in secret over the past year. More importantly, every major population center on Earth and the other inhabited worlds had been evacuated to underground bunkers equipped with their own life support systems and communication networks. The humans hadn't just militarized their space, they had turned their entire civilization into a single, coordinated weapon system. As the entity approached Earth's orbit, it began displaying the same analytical behavior we'd observed in previous Devourer encounters. Sensor sweeps probed our defenses, cataloging weapon types and formation patterns. Smaller vessels detached from its surface to conduct reconnaissance missions. Everything proceeded exactly as our intelligence had predicted. Right up until the moment Captain Chen opened a channel to the entire human fleet and spoke 4 words that would be remembered as long as intelligent life existed in the galaxy. Light them up, people. What happened next defied every law of physics and military strategy I thought I understood. The Sol system didn't just fight back. It exploded into violent life. Weapons emerged from asteroids that had appeared to be simple mining operations. Space stations revealed themselves to be massive gun platforms. Even the orbital habitats around Earth opened like deadly flowers, exposing weapon systems that had been hidden beneath false civilian facades. The Devourer entity, faced with an attack from directions it hadn't known existed, reeled back in what could only be described as surprise. Its conversion tendrils lashed out wildly, trying to counter threats that seemed to materialize from empty space. But that was just the beginning. All ships, came Admiral Zhang's voice over the command channel. Execute Prometheus Protocol in 3, 2, 1, mark. Every human vessel in the system simultaneously activated systems I'd never seen before. Devices that seemed to tear holes in space itself. The defiant hope shuddered around me as energies I couldn't comprehend flowed through her hull. Kethvar, Captain Chen called out over the chaos. Remember when you asked me what made humans different? Look around you. This is what we do when we're backed into a corner. I looked at the tactical display and saw something that would haunt my dreams for the rest of my life. The humans hadn't just weaponized their technology. They had weaponized their own existence. Every ship, every station, every inhabited world in the system was burning itself out to generate the kind of destructive power usually associated with stellar events. They were turning their entire civilization into a weapon, knowing that the process would destroy everything they had ever built. The entity tried to adapt, tried to counter the impossible energies being directed at it. But how do you defend against an enemy that has chosen to become a living bomb? As the first conversion charges began detonating in sequence throughout the system, I finally understood the true meaning of human courage. They weren't brave because they didn't feel fear. They were brave because they had looked at their fear, accepted it, and chosen to act anyway. And in that moment, as the Sol system began to tear itself apart around us, I realized that I had become something I never thought possible. I had become human in all the ways that truly mattered. The Sol system died screaming. That's the only way I can describe what happened when the Prometheus Protocol reached full activation. Planets that had sheltered human civilization for millennia became fusion bombs. Space stations that had housed millions of lives transformed into directed energy weapons. Even the sun itself seemed to pulse with unnatural light as hidden installations in its corona-activated systems that I still don't fully understand. I was on the bridge of the Defiant Hope, watching the tactical display paint a picture of systematic self-destruction on a scale that defied comprehension. Earth's moon had just triggered its conversion charges, turning Luna's entire mass into a directed plasma stream aimed at the Devourer entity's core. The blast was so intense that it temporarily overloaded our senses, leaving us blind for nearly 30 seconds. When our vision cleared, the entity was still there. Wounded, writhing in apparent agony, but still very much alive. Damage assessment, Captain Chen called out, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding us. Entity is showing significant structural damage to approximately 15% of its mass, reported Lieutenant Torres. But it's adapting faster than anticipated. The damaged sections are being jettisoned and replaced with new growth. I watched in horror as the creature responded to our attack by doing something I hadn't thought possible. It began consuming the destroyed remnants of Luna to rebuild itself. Within minutes, the entity had not only repaired the damage we'd inflicted, but had grown larger in the process. Captain, I said, fighting to keep despair out of my voice. It's learning from our attack. The conversion charges won't work twice. I know, Chen replied grimly, which is why we're moving to Phase 2. Phase 2, it turned out, was even more insane than Phase 1. Instead of continuing to bombard the entity from a distance, the human fleet began moving directly toward it. Not attacking, approaching. Our ships, along with the refugee vessels that had chosen to stay, formed a loose formation that looked almost like a funeral procession as we flew straight into the nightmare that had consumed half the galaxy. All vessels, came Admiral Zhang's voice over the command channel. Initiate boarding protocols. Remember, the objective isn't to destroy the entity from the outside. We're going inside. The bridge of the Defiant Hope fell silent. Even by human standards, deliberately boarding a hostile entity the size of a small moon was beyond insane. It was a form of tactical thinking that existed in its own category of impossibility. Ma'am, said Chief Harrison, his usual confidence replaced by something approaching awe. Did I hear that correctly? We're going to board that thing? That's correct, Chief, Chen replied. The entity is essentially a massive biological computer, processing and coordinating the activities of the entire Devourer fleet. If we can reach its core systems and introduce enough chaos into its decision-making processes, we might be able to trigger a cascade failure. Sub-Commander Yithel, who had been studying the sensor readings, looked up with an expression of professional concern. Captain, even if we could somehow penetrate the entity's outer defenses, we have no idea what we'd find inside. The environment could be toxic, the internal structure could be completely alien, and we'd be operating with no possibility of extraction or reinforcement. Chen smiled with the expression. I'd learned to associate with human tactical creativity at its most dangerous. Yithel, you've been working with humans long enough to know that impossible is just another word for not yet attempted. Besides, we've got advantages the entity won't be expecting. She gestured toward the mixed crew around us. Humans, Zolani, Thorians, Kitherians, and Morgothi, all working together with a coordination that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. The Devourers are a hive mind. They think in terms of unified purpose and coordinated action. They've never encountered a group like us, completely different species working together not because we're controlled by the same intelligence, but because we've chosen to cooperate. That kind of voluntary coordination is going to be completely outside their experience. Over the next hour, as we approached the entity's surface, I began to understand the true scope of what the humans had planned. This wasn't just a boarding action, it was an invasion by an army that had no right to exist. The refugee fleets had been carrying far more than just civilians and military personnel. Hidden in the cargo bays of transport ships and disguised as humanitarian supplies were weapons, equipment, and personnel from dozens of different military traditions. Zalani heavy assault troops, trained for boarding actions against fortified positions. Thorian tunnel fighters equipped with tools for operating in hostile environments. Kytherian reconnaissance specialists whose sensory capabilities could map unknown territories. Morgatar technical experts who could interface with almost any form of electronic system. The humans had taken the survivors of a dozen defeated civilizations and forged them into a single, unified military force specifically designed for the kind of impossible mission we were about to attempt. Remember, Captain Chen addressed the combined boarding parties over the ship's communication system. We're not trying to conquer this thing, we're trying to confuse it. Every action you take inside the entity should be as unpredictable as possible. Don't follow standard infiltration protocols. Don't stick to the mission plan. Make decisions on the fly. Adapt to whatever you encounter. And above all, trust your teammates even when their actions don't make sense to you. The surface of the entity when we reached it was even more horrifying up close than it had appeared on the tactical displays. It pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that hurt to look at directly, and the whole plating, if it could be called that, seemed to shift and flow like living tissue. Worse, I could see the shapes of converted starships embedded in the creature's flesh, their weapons turned outward like the spines of some impossible sea creature. "Boarding tubes away," reported Chief Harrison, as our ship extended flexible connection tunnels toward what appeared to be a relatively stable section of the entity's hull. Similar reports came in from dozens of other vessels as the entire boarding force prepared to enter the nightmare we had been fighting for so long. The moment we made contact with the entity's surface, everything changed. The hull beneath our boarding tube didn't resist penetration, it welcomed it. The surface opened like a mouth, drawing our connection tunnel inside with a horrible wet sound that I felt through the ship's superstructure. Around us, the entity's bioluminescent patterns began pulsing faster, and I realized we were looking at something like excitement. "It wants us to come inside," I said, the implications hitting me like a physical blow. "This is a trap." "Of course it's a trap," Chen replied calmly. "The question is, who's trapping whom?" The boarding party consisted of 47 beings from 6 different species, each equipped with weapons and equipment designed for fighting in unknown environments. We entered the entity through what appeared to be some kind of airlock system, but the walls around us were clearly organic. They pulsed with their own heartbeat and wept fluids I didn't want to identify. The interior of the entity defied description. Corridors that seemed designed for humanoid movement branched off in directions that violated 3-dimensional geometry. The lighting came from bioluminescent patches that responded to our presence by growing brighter or dimmer in patterns that suggested intelligence. And everywhere, embedded in the walls like exhibits in some twisted museum, were the remains of beings from civilizations the Devourers had consumed. "Stay together," Chen ordered as we moved deeper into the structure. "And remember, the entity is analyzing everything we do. Don't give it patterns to work with." What followed was the strangest military operation in galactic history. Instead of moving as a coordinated unit, we deliberately scattered into smaller groups that acted independently. Instead of following standard room-clearing procedures, we made decisions based on intuition and random chance. When we encountered obstacles, we solved them using whatever methods occurred to us in the moment, no matter how unconventional. The entity tried to respond to our actions, but we could see its confusion in the way the bioluminescent patterns faltered and shifted. It was designed to counter organized military forces, not chaotic groups of individuals acting on their own initiative. We'd been inside for approximately 2 hours when we encountered the first active defenses. The corridor ahead of us suddenly filled with creatures that might once have been Zalani, but had been changed into something that belonged in nightmares. They moved with perfect coordination, their converted weapons firing in synchronized patterns that should have been impossible to survive. Under normal circumstances, we would have been slaughtered, but Chief Harrison, operating on pure human instinct, suddenly started singing a ridiculous song about something called dancing bananas that he claimed to have learned as a child. The sound was so unexpected, so completely inappropriate to the situation, that the converted creatures actually stopped firing for a moment. In that moment of confusion, our Thorian engineer launched himself over our heads, using his species' natural digging claws to tunnel through what he apparently thought was a weak section of wall. The Kytherian scout followed him, not because it made tactical sense, but because she'd become curious about something she detected with her enhanced senses. Meanwhile, Sub-Commander Yithal and I provided covering fire using weapons we'd never trained with, while our Morgothi technical specialist attempted to interface with what appeared to be a control node embedded in the floor. It should have been a disaster. By every principle of military science, our completely uncoordinated response should have resulted in everyone's death within minutes. Instead, we broke through the entity's defenses and found ourselves in what appeared to be some kind of central processing chamber. The room was vast, so large that its far walls disappeared into bioluminescent fog. But what dominated the space was a structure that rose from the floor like a twisted tree, its branches reaching toward a ceiling I couldn't see, and pulsing along those branches, like fruit made of light, were what I realized were the stored consciousnesses of every being the Devourers had ever consumed. Millions of them, possibly billions. "Dear God," whispered Harrison. "They're all still in there." It was Captain Chen who understood the implications first. "They're not just storing the knowledge," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of horror and growing excitement. "They're storing the actual minds. The entity isn't just using what it learned from conquered civilizations. It's using the civilizations themselves as processing power." The tactical possibilities hit me immediately. If we could somehow disrupt the storage system, we'd free every consciousness the Devourers have ever captured, Chen finished. And suddenly their unified hive mind would be dealing with billions of individual intelligences, all of whom have very good reasons to be angry. What we did next violated every principle of sensible military action I'd ever learned. Instead of trying to destroy the storage system, we began trying to wake it up, using tools and techniques from 6 different civilizations, working without any coordination beyond a shared desperate hope. We began systematically introducing chaos into the entity's processing matrix. The Morgothi specialist interfaced directly with the control systems, while the Thorian engineer used his claws to physically damage critical connection points. The Kytherian scout provided sensory guidance, while Yithal and I used our weapons to target what appeared to be key neural nodes. And Chief Harrison continued singing that ridiculous song, because apparently it was having some kind of disruptive effect on the entity's decision-making processes. The response was immediate and terrifying. The entire structure around us began to convulse as the entity realized what we were doing. Alarms that sounded like screaming echoed through the chamber. The bioluminescent patterns shifted to colors that caused physical pain to look at. But something else was happening. The stored consciousnesses began to flicker more rapidly, and I started to hear voices. Whispers at first, then growing stronger. Zelenai voices, Thorian voices. Voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize, from civilizations that had been consumed before I was born. They were waking up, and they were very, very angry. The entity's death scream, when it came, was audible across half the galaxy. But by then, we were no longer alone inside the nightmare we'd entered. We were accompanied by the awakened ghosts of every civilization the Devourers had ever destroyed, and together, we were tearing their great weapon apart from the inside. For the first time since the invasion began, the Devourers were learning what it felt like to be afraid. The liberation of the stored consciousnesses was like watching the birth of a new universe. What started as whispers in the entity's processing matrix became a roar of awakening minds, each one carrying the memories and knowledge of civilizations the Devourers thought they had consumed completely. But these weren't just passive recordings. They were active intelligences, and they had been aware during their imprisonment. They remembered everything. The entity convulsed around us as billions of voices began speaking at once, not in harmony, but in chaotic discord. The Devourer's perfect hive mind, which had operated as a single coordinated intelligence for millennia, suddenly found itself hosting every species it had ever conquered, all of them demanding answers, revenge, and freedom. "Can you hear them?" Captain Chen asked, her voice barely audible over the psychic storm raging around us. I could. My enhanced Alani hearing was picking up fragments of conversation in dozens of languages. But what struck me most was the tone. These weren't the voices of victims. They were the voices of soldiers who had been forced to fight their own kind and were finally free to choose their own side. The chamber we were in began to change as the awakened consciousnesses took control of the entity's biological systems. Walls that had pulsed with the rhythm of the devourer hive mind began flickering with new patterns, chaotic, individual, gloriously unpredictable. The tree-like structure in the center of the room, which had been the focal point of the entity's processing power, began to bloom with lights I recognized as Thorian geometric patterns, Cytherian musical harmonies, translated into bioluminescence, and even the crisp mathematical precision of Zolani tactical displays. "They're taking over," Sub-Commander Ythal observed, her voice filled with awe. "The stored minds are seizing control of the entity's systems." But the entity wasn't giving up without a fight. Even as we watched, sections of the chamber began sealing themselves off, cutting the awakened consciousnesses away from critical systems. The Devourer intelligence was trying to quarantine the rebellion, to maintain control over its most vital functions. It was Chief Harrison who provided the solution, in typical human fashion. "Hey!" he called out to the voices in the walls. "You want to get back at these bastards? We know how to hurt them where it counts. But we need access to their communications array." The response was immediate. Sections of wall began dissolving, revealing passageways that led deeper into the entity's core systems. But these weren't the nightmarish corridors we'd traveled to reach this point. They were passages created by intelligences that wanted to help us, lit by patterns that were almost cheerful in their defiant chaos. What followed was the strangest military advance in galactic history. Our small boarding party, accompanied by the electronic ghosts of countless civilizations, fought our way through the entity's immune systems toward its central communication nexus. But we weren't fighting alone. The awakened consciousnesses had turned the entity's own defenses against it, creating safe passages and disabling threat systems. It was like being guided by the collective wisdom of every military force that had ever existed. The communication center, when we reached it, was exactly what Captain Chen had hoped for. A massive organic array that connected the entity to every Devourer vessel in the galaxy. More importantly, it was the hub through which the hive mind's commands flowed to its scattered fleets. If we can introduce the same chaos we've created here into the broader Devourer network, Chen explained as our Morgati technical specialist began interfacing with the communication systems, we can spread the consciousness rebellion throughout their entire civilization. The implications were staggering. Every Devourer vessel contained stored minds from conquered civilizations. Minds that could potentially be awakened and turned against their captors. If we could trigger a galaxy-wide uprising of the Devourer's own victims, we wouldn't just be fighting them. We'd be liberating everyone they'd ever conquered. "There's just one problem," reported the Morgati specialist, her crystalline form flickering with concerned patterns. "The communication array requires direct neural interface to operate, and Devourer systems are biologically toxic to most known species. The feedback could kill whoever attempts it." I found myself thinking about everything I'd learned from the humans over the past year. About courage that wasn't the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. About the willingness to sacrifice everything for a cause greater than yourself. About the simple, terrible beauty of beings who would rather die fighting than live in surrender. "I'll do it," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "Kethvar, no," Ythal protested. "The neural feedback from a system this size could burn out your entire nervous system." "Maybe," I replied, moving toward the interface array. "But maybe not. And if it works, we free everyone who's ever been taken by these monsters." Captain Chen grabbed my arm as I passed her. "You don't have to do this. We can find another way." I looked at her, this remarkable human who had taught me what it meant to choose hope over logic, courage over safety, defiance over despair, and smiled. "Yes, I do. You humans have a saying, someone has to do it. Well, someone does. And today, that someone is me." The interface was a writhing mass of organic conduits that seemed designed to connect directly to the neural pathways of whatever species used it. As I approached, the awakened consciousnesses in the walls began whispering encouragement in languages I didn't understand, but somehow comprehended anyway. They had all faced this same choice at some point, the decision to risk everything for the chance to strike back at the darkness. The moment I made contact with the interface, pain beyond description flooded through my nervous system. It was like being connected to every moment of agony the Devourers had ever inflicted, every death they had caused, every civilization they had consumed. For a moment I thought I would be overwhelmed completely. Then I heard the voices, not just the awakened minds in this entity, but consciousnesses throughout the galaxy, trapped in Devourer vessels, stored in processing facilities, held in containment systems across dozens of star systems. They were all connected through the communication network, and they were all waiting. Using every technique I'd learned from human military doctrine, I began introducing chaos into the network. Not the organized precision of Zilani tactical thinking, but the glorious unpredictability of beings who refuse to be categorized or controlled. The response was instantaneous. Across the galaxy, stored consciousnesses began awakening. Devourer vessels found themselves dealing with rebellions from within as their own processing systems turned against them. Entire fleets began breaking formation as their coordination networks collapsed under the weight of millions of individual minds demanding freedom. But the most beautiful moment came when I felt the awakened intelligences begin to coordinate, not as a hive mind, but as something unprecedented in galactic history. They were forming a voluntary collective, individuals choosing to work together without losing their essential nature. The entity around us began to die as its central intelligence was overwhelmed by the consciousness rebellion. But it wasn't the violent death we'd expected. It was more like a transformation. The bioluminescent patterns shifted from the cold uniformity of devourer control to the warm chaos of individual expression. Kefa! I heard Captain Chen calling my name, but her voice seemed to come from very far away. Kefa, you need to disconnect. I wanted to, but I was seeing something through the network that changed everything. The awakened consciousnesses weren't just rebelling. They were taking control of devourer technology and turning it toward a new purpose. Instead of consumption and conversion, they were beginning the work of restoration. Throughout the galaxy, devourer vessels were transforming into rescue ships. Processing facilities were becoming hospitals for the treatment of partially converted beings. The massive biomechanical infrastructure that had been built for conquest was being repurposed for healing. With tremendous effort, I disconnected from the interface and collapsed to the chamber floor. Through eyes that felt like they were on fire, I could see that the room around us was changing. The organic walls were becoming something new, not devourer, not any single species architecture, but a hybrid style that incorporated design elements from every civilization that had ever been stored in the network. Status report, I managed to croak. Chief Harrison, who was monitoring our communications with the outside, looked up with an expression of wonder. Sir, we're getting reports from across the galaxy. Devourer fleets are standing down. Some are actually offering assistance to worlds they were attacking. And he paused, double-checking his readings. Sir, we're detecting massive construction activity in the formerly occupied systems. It looks like they're building something. Over the following days, as we made our way back to what remained of the Sol system, the scope of what had happened became clear. The consciousness rebellion hadn't just freed the stored minds. It had created something entirely new. A galactic civilization that combined the knowledge and capabilities of every species the Devourers had consumed, but organized around principles of voluntary cooperation rather than forced unity. They called themselves the Liberated Collective, and their first act was to begin the work of restoration. Worlds that had been consumed were slowly rebuilt. Species that had been thought extinct were reconstructed from stored genetic templates. The vast Devourer fleet was transformed into a reconstruction armada, spreading across the galaxy to undo the damage of their previous incarnation. But perhaps most remarkably, they remembered their debt to the humans. Earth had been severely damaged by the Prometheus Protocol, its surface scarred by the fusion explosions that had been necessary to wound the entity. The other worlds of the Sol system had suffered similar devastation. By any reasonable measure, human civilization had sacrificed itself to save the galaxy. The Liberated Collective wasn't going to let that sacrifice stand. Within months, ships began arriving in the Sol system carrying technologies beyond human comprehension, not to conquer or control, but to rebuild. Earth was restored not just to its former state, but to something better, a world where human creativity was enhanced by alien knowledge, where the scars of war became monuments to the courage that had saved everyone. I was there, still recovering from my neural trauma, when the first restored human cities came online. The integration of liberated collective technology with human ingenuity produced wonders that neither could have achieved alone. Architecture that responded to the emotions of its inhabitants. Transportation systems that anticipated need before it was expressed. Art that incorporated sensory spectrums from dozens of different species. But the greatest wonder was watching the humans adapt to their new circumstances with the same chaotic creativity they'd shown in war. They didn't just accept the gifts of the Liberated Collective, they improved them, modified them, made them uniquely human in ways their creators hadn't imagined possible. Captain Chen, now Admiral Chen, and coordinator of human collective relations, found me in the observation deck of the orbital station where I was recuperating from my neural injuries. "How are you feeling?" she asked, settling into the chair beside me. "Different," I replied honestly. The neural interface changed something fundamental about how I process information. I can still think like a Zilani, but I can also think like... I struggled for the right words. Like everyone else. All at once. She nodded thoughtfully. The doctors say you're the first being in galactic history to have direct neural contact with a truly universal consciousness. That has to be overwhelming. Not overwhelming, I corrected. Liberating. For the first time in my life, I understand what it really means to be part of something larger than yourself, while still remaining yourself. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the reconstruction efforts in the space around Earth. Liberated collective bioships worked alongside human engineering vessels, their different approaches to problem-solving creating solutions that neither could have developed alone. Can I ask you something? Chen said eventually. Of course. Back in the entity's communication center, when you volunteered for the neural interface, that wasn't a Zilani decision, was it? That was something else. I considered her question carefully. She was right, of course. The Kethvar who had fled the destruction of the Zilani Empire would never have made such a choice. That being had been defined by careful calculation, precise planning, and the absolute certainty that some battles couldn't be won. But somewhere in the months of fighting alongside humans, of learning to embrace chaos and uncertainty, of discovering that the impossible was just another word for not yet attempted, I had become something new? No, I said finally. That wasn't a Zilani decision. It was a human one. She smiled. I thought so. You know, there's been some discussion in the collective about what to call beings like you, people who've adopted human approaches to problem-solving regardless of their biological origins. The term they've settled on is honorary humans. I felt a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with my species' physiology. I can think of no greater honor. As I watched the ships working together in Earth's orbit, human vessels flying alongside the transformed remnants of the Devourer fleet, refugee ships from dozens of species contributing their own unique capabilities, all working toward the common goal of rebuilding what had been lost, I realized that we had accomplished something unprecedented in galactic history. We had turned the universe's greatest nightmare into its greatest hope. We had taken an enemy that consumed civilizations and transformed it into a force for restoration and growth. We had proven that even the darkest darkness could be overcome by beings willing to light a single flame and refuse to let it be extinguished. And we had done it all because a species of short-lived bipeds from a backwater world had taught the galaxy a simple truth. Sometimes the only way to win is to refuse to lose. The terror I had faced, the realization that everything I thought I knew about power and courage was wrong, had become the foundation for something beautiful. The humans had shown me that strength wasn't about superior technology or flawless tactics. It was about the willingness to stand up when falling down would be easier, to fight when surrender would be logical, and to hope when despair would be reasonable. They had taught me that sometimes the smallest flame burns brightest in the deepest darkness. And in learning that lesson, I had become more than I ever thought possible, not just a survivor of a dead empire, but a citizen of something greater than any empire had ever been. A galaxy united not by conquest but by choice, not by force but by the simple recognition that some things are worth fighting for no matter the cost. As the twin suns of the restored Sol system set over the rebuilt Earth, I made a decision that would have been impossible for the Kethvar who had fled Zilani Prime all those months ago. I decided to stay. This was my home now, not because I had been born here, but because I had chosen it. And in making that choice, I had learned the most important lesson the humans could teach. That family isn't about blood, or species, or origin. Family is about who stands beside you when the darkness comes, and who helps you light the way forward when the battle is won. I had found my family.